Well, the other one is you made a joke about open source, right? And which I actually like, and it's like about Pi Lake. And I'm just curious, like, from your experiences, because typically you're not involved with open source as much. Like, do you find it problematic? Do you find it troublesome? Do you find it a waste of time? I'm just curious, what's your take on open source? Because I'm sure you, as a small business, right? You, as a business that works with small business and large businesses, nevertheless, right? You see it, but do you feel do you feel any FOMO? Do you feel like there's a loss? Do you feel that there's a gain? I'm just curious from your perspective.
The way that I would put it is, generally speaking, open source implementing open source solutions tends to require more labor to get the solutions implemented, especially when it comes to the security pieces.
Mm.
So that is my general train of thought when it comes to thinking, is open source worth it in this situation or not?
Mm.
Um, and again, a lot of people think, oh, closed source is evil and whatnot, and it's not necessarily. There is always a trade-off, and
Mm-hmm.
obviously too with closed source, you have, to some extent, from a business perspective, that liability of, hey, this business is providing this service to me, um, and they're responsible to different levels according to the law to what happens to my information, my data, if anything goes wrong. You have sort of that reassurance on the with closed source solutions. You don't have that with open source. In addition to, again, that additional time requirement to implement them. I'm not saying that they're bad, and I'm not saying that you should never implement open source solutions. I'm saying for a lot of companies, for example, I like referring to manufacturing companies because I've come from those. Tech has been a latter part of my life thing and not
Mm.
early
Gotcha.
part of
Okay.
my life. So I've come from more of those businesses that are hustling to get through with their tech stack. Okay.
Sure.
Um, they usually don't have the financial bandwidth to be doing open source. I've seen individuals that like to do it and start doing open source stuff, and it's really more of a self skill enrichment thing than
Right.
a what's best for the business. And I say that respectfully. I'm someone that started using Python where before we had closed source solutions at a company only, and I built some Python scripts to automate. That's how I taught myself Python. But the reality is, it takes more time generally, not always.
Mm-hmm.
There are some open source solutions that are, especially software that's open source, that it's very very handy for a lot of things, like recording with OBS. I think OBS Studio, that's what I use for recording. So I love that.
Right.
But in terms of your tech stack, there's just a lot more components that come along with that. So
Oh no, I think that's completely fair. I mean, I think you and I have been sort of basically saying, right tool. You find the right tool for the right job. That's it.
correct.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, the reality is, I think everything you're saying is correct. I
Yeah.
think that open source, obviously, it's a love for me, but do I use open source exclusively for everything? No, quite the opposite, right? There are things where I think it makes a ton of sense to have that, and there are things where I'm like, you know what? I could definitely use a proprietary system here in this case. And guess what? Different people
Hmm.
are going to have different opinions of that exact same statement because each person has their own strengths, their
Yeah.
own desires, their own what they're good at and what they're bad at, and they're trying to replace what they're bad at. Perfect. By all means, do what makes sense for you.
Yeah. And I think to sum it, and I'll throw this out there just as a bonus too, is even the concept of vendor locks, right? I know a lot of people talk vendor locks, and honestly, I know it's even part of Databricks' marketing with when it comes
Oh,
to
of course.
vendor locks and whatnot. I think those get overrated, get overblown because personally been in companies where they're using the same solution for a long time, not because they not you know not because their data is stock or anything like that. It's mainly because no one wants to do the migration work of actually having to re-engineer pipelines or to set up new systems or do the administration and whatnot. You know, that's the practicality, especially when you're not doing a migration every 2 years. You're doing it if you're doing a migration every 5 years, even that's a little bit painful unless you really absolutely need to. But honestly, there's a lot of in the servicing industry built just on people migrating. I mean, not. I mean, I'll throw a little jab at Microsoft there. I mean, that's why they keep on doing something new every 5 years so they can keep their. So I don't really believe that's why they do it, but yeah. So
No, I mean, the if you migrate every 5 years, hopefully it's because you're expanding massively, and then you've just
yeah,
basically broken the systems. Like you've hit the breaking point of the system, and then to an extent you're sort of right. Then it's like, okay, well, I'll sell you the idea that I can build a system that can handle 5,000 exabytes worth of data, and you're going, great. Like I hope I can get it there, but that's a little expensive for me to start off with right from the get go, right?
yeah,
So yeah, to your point exactly. I feel that when it comes to these systems, right? The, it goes back to like what we started, you and I started, even from the standpoint of Gen AI and open source at the same time, right? Which is, do you know your own business? And if you know your own business, what's core to your business? Focus on that and then decide whether it's proprietary or open source, what makes sense for the sake of the core of your business.
yeah,
And until you know those things, any vendor can come in and tell you, let me go ahead and toss in a Gen AI and it'll magically solve your problem. Let me go ahead and toss in an open source project and it'll magically, you'll never have vendor lock-in. We can always throw that out there. But the reality is, unless you know what your core business is in the first place, all of it is nonsensical. It doesn't actually help what you're trying to do in the first place.